Welcome to another Technocamps virtual workshop. This is part 2 of the Learning to Draw with Code. In this session we'll go through variables and functions. So let's open up our online editor and we can start programming. If you saved your code previously, you will be able to open your code from the last session. Otherwise, you'll be starting from scratch. How and why do we use these? It makes our code easier to read and it's cleaner. We can set all our variables at the start of our program with their assigned values, and these values can change throughout the code, allowing the code to be flexible. Let's take a look at how we can use a variable in our code. At the end of the previous session, we introduced for loops and how we use these to create a shape. If we just take a moment to look at this code, which elements of that code would you say are changeable and therefore could be assigned as a variable? We have 3 which we could use. The 4 is the number of sides of the shape, and this can change. The size of the shape can change, and also the angle for each of these can change as well. So if we look on the right hand side, we can assign the variable sides with a value of 4. We can assign the size to a value of 100, but we do something different with the angle. Variables don't need to be static. We can use other variables to calculate the value of a specific variable. So with the angle, as we talked about this last time, is 360 divided by the number of sides. Here we have the angle which equals 360, and we divide it by the number of sides which have been assigned to this variable here. So now we can assign these variables at the top of our program. So each variable has a value, but currently we do not use these in our program. So take a moment and try and work these out for yourself. So where would we put the variable size, and angle in our for loop? So it would look like this. For x in the range of sides, so this is the number of times we repeat the loop. So for this instance, we are repeating it 4 times. And then we move forward by the size value, which has been assigned 100. And we turn right by the angle, which is 360 divided by the number of sides, which equals 90. And this for loop replaces the for loop we had previously. Now we have our variables assigned in our for loop. Each time we run through this project, these variables here will get calculated and changed to these values up here which have been assigned. So now if you look at this code, it's easier to read than before. We understand that in this for loop we have the number of sides here, the size of the loop and the angle, and all these can be changed at the top of the project. So this becomes useful when you need to create multiple for loops. So now we've set the variables, try and change the values and see what happens to your shape. What other shapes can you make? And see what happens when you change the value of 360. So with a square, if you use the value of 300 divided by the number of sides, what shape would we get? So now we've created one shape. We want to make more than one shape on our canvas to make it more interesting. And for this, we need to be able to lift the pen off the canvas, move the pen around, put the pen back down, and then carry on drawing in another location on our canvas. So to do this, we need to use the pen up and pen down commands. So initially we would draw our first shape. So this would be our first for loop. And then we would say pen up, move, and then pen down. And then we would have our next for loop where we would draw another shape. So using these 2 commands, can you draw more than one shape on your canvas? So here's a program where we use the pen up and pen down commands. So we set our variables at the start of the program here. We draw our first shape here, so this is the first square. And now we need to move between both squares. So we need to lift the pen off the canvas. We need to move our turtle around. And then we need to put the pen back down. So this will lift the pen from here, move him over to here, put the pen back down, and then he would start drawing once again. And this is where we do our next square. Now, try and implement the pen up and pen down into your program. If you look at this code, what do we notice? What was the reason for using a for loop? If you come up with code repetition, you're correct. As you can see here, we're using exactly the same code here that we are using here. What would happen if we had an error in this code and we copied and pasted it all the way through our program? We would have errors all across our program. We would have to go through every for loop and change all those error messages. This leads nicely onto the next section of this workshop where we talk about functions. So what is a function? A function is a block of code where you can write code once and keep using that throughout your program. So here we would define the function at the start of the program. So we would define the function name here, and inside that function we would write the code for that function. So if we wanted to draw the square, we could say define draw square, and in here we would have the variables, so sides equals 4, angle equals 360 divided by size, and then we would have the for loop inside this one function. Then we would go to our main program code here, and each time we wanted to draw a square, we would call back to that function here. So if this was called my underscore function underscore name, we would write that here, and that would run this code here. So each time we would want to use that function, we simply write the name of the function in our code. So you can see how this makes things easier. If there is a problem in this function code, we simply change it at the top of our program once, and it updates all the functions within our program. So let's have a look how this would actually work in our program. So this is our old code. This is what we currently have, where we're drawing the shape here, we're moving, and then we're drawing the shape once again. Now, at the top of our program, we define a function called draw underscore square. And in here, we need to define the number of sides of the square and the angle of the square. And then we use the same code here for the for loop. So for x in range of sides, move forward and move right. And we paste that code into here. So this is our function here, this complete box here. And each time we call this draw underscore square function in our main program, it will call this function here and draw a square. So using this function, try and draw a square first, and then create a new function called draw a triangle, and change elements of this code to make a triangle appear on your canvas, and try and define other functions to draw different shapes. See what shapes you can create. Here's some examples of multiple functions. So we have a square, which we went through in the previous slide, and hopefully you've all managed to create a triangle, which will look something similar to this. And these functions can be called throughout our code to make our code cleaner and easier to understand, and also easier to modify in the future. But if we look at this code, is there something you can see that's common in both functions? So think back to the for loops and why we use for loops and why are we creating functions. That's right, code repetition is taking place once again. We're using exactly the same script in both functions. So this leads quite nicely onto the final topic for this workshop, where we talk about function parameters. A function parameter is a value you give to the function at the point you call it in your program to enable it to give you different outputs. So here we have a square and a triangle. If you have a look at this code, where are the variables? What are the values we can change in the code. That's right, the size and the size of the objects are the two variables that change throughout the code. All the other code in these functions are exactly the same. So knowing this, we could create one function now, which takes in two parameters. One parameter for the size of the object, and another parameter for the size of the object. So if we look at a completed function now, rather than calling it draw square, draw triangle, we can call it draw shape. And here we can define what parameters that function requires. It requires a number of sides of the shape and what size you want that shape to be. Then inside that function, we simply have the rest of the code. So the angle will equal 360 divided by the sides, so whatever value has been passed into here. And then 4x in the range of sides, which will take this value once again, this parameter. And we move forward by this parameter here, size, and then we turn right by the angle which has been calculated in this function. If we wanted to use this function throughout our code, we would call the function like we did before by its name, so draw underscore shape. And this time in the parentheses, we would define the number of sides of the shape and the size. Each time the function is called, it would input each of these parameters into the variables of this function. So for instance, this would draw a shape which is a square, as it has 4 sides and 100 sides. What shape would this create? Using this draw function now, try and draw multiple shapes and see how this function works. And then we will look at a completed program in the next slide. In this slide, this is the completed program, which is using the draw shape function, and it's calling the function throughout the program. So initially, what do? We import the Turtle Python library, and then we define a draw shape. And this draw shape has two parameters, the number of sides and the size of the shape. Inside this function, we calculate the angle by dividing 360 by the number of sides, which is a parameter in the function. And then we tell the turtle to put the pen down. So we put the pen down here. And then we draw the shape. And then we tell the pen to come up. So once we've completed drawing this shape, we lift the pen up. And that will become important in a second. So that is our completed function. We create an object, my turtle, and each time we want to draw a shape, we call this function and we pass it two parameters. And remember I said these are quite important now. Each time we draw the shape, we put the pen down, we draw the shape and we lift the pen up. This makes this bit of code cleaner. We draw the shape, at the end of the function we lift the pen off the paper. So now we can freely move around the canvas without drawing any further. And then we draw the shape again. And each time we call the function draw shape, it puts the pen down and it lifts the pen back up. So this just creates cleaner code to read down here. So now using functions, try and create some shapes. Use this function, try and modify the function and see what shapes and creations you can come up with. In this workshop, we didn't include the colours or the fill colours, so I'd like to see what you can create using the fill colours and the pen colours. Thank you again for joining me on an online Technocamps workshop. Please share your work with other students who are completing these courses online via our social media platforms, and don't forget to hashtag Technocamps online. Take care and goodbye.